I've never watched the Sonic OVA. I have absolutely no idea what sort of moves Sonic pulls off in it. The closest I've gotten to in experiencing it is putting lookalike in all my music playlists, because that song is, in the words of today's youth, Kino. Having said that, I initially assumed that BlueM's OVA Sonic mod was in fact based off the Sonic CD opening animation. Embarrassing, and having written half the script with that idea in my head, I've gone for editing it rather than rewriting it. So if I seem to talk as if OVA Sonic is based off the CD opening and not, the OVA, you know why. But regardless, let's get into it. OVA Sonic has 4 abilities, which strangely seem to be more based on the Sonic CD opening than anything else, although obviously adapted to work in SRB2. His primary ability, one of the 2 you control directly, is the Super Spin, functioning basically as a chargeable double jump. The idea is that the longer you hold jump once in the air is proportional to the height and power the extra launch has, capping out after about 5 seconds. All well and good, but I find that it doesn't seem to work properly the majority of the time. Looking at GIFs on the mod page and using basic deduction, I can assume that you should move ahead when using this ability, even if it does stop you from falling, which keeps your flow going to some extent. The problem is, I find that most of the time I use this ability, OVA Sonic just stops dead in midair, entirely refusing to move. And this isn't linked to whether or not you're moving prior to using it either. I find that the game actively drops my momentum until I stop. I could understand it if it was some sort of incentive not to hold it for too long, or to be a trade-off between height and distance gained, but this happens far too quickly for me to believe that it is intentional, especially when it goes hand in hand with the ability not seeming to have the proper charge to increase height properties in the first place, as I find that I often get less height the longer I charge. What's even more confusing is that the ability does sometimes work, with the proper charge mechanics and horizontal movement, and when it does, it works well in tandem with his other major ability. So, an interesting idea to translate this scene into an actional functional gameplay ability, but I feel it's already been pulled off more successfully before with Junior Sonic's Aim Thock. And to further compare him to Junior Sonic, OVA Sonic shares some abilities wholesale. You have the dash mode, because God knows you have to have one of them in your moveset. When your abilities are all working correctly, this is a moveset that can somewhat support it, so I've certainly seen more jarring implementations, but it still doesn't fit in completely seamlessly. And beyond that, you also have a peel out. I understand why people love the peel out, it's so cool looking when properly implemented, but it is basically just a more dynamic looking spin dash. It does have this effect that makes it seem like you're in dash mode, so I thought it might be different by being an instant access gateway to that, but you can still hear the dash mode pop after a few seconds, so it clearly isn't. Outside of those, the big differentiator is your final ability, OVA Sonic's passive ability to climb walls. Other Sonics have attempted to do wall climbing before, to varying degrees of success, but I do have to say that this is probably one of the best attempts I've tried yet. All you have to do to use the ability is jump into a wall, and OVA Sonic will immediately begin scaling it. No other button needs to be held down, and there's no time limit before you drop off where you need to do something else. In fact, you'll actually continue to gain speed whilst climbing walls, so there's no stamina or speed lock like you have with most other characters. That makes sense when you think about it. Sonic is generally portrayed as going so fast that he can scale walls much the same as he can run across the floor. It also, when the 2 abilities are both fully working correctly, pairs extremely well with the Super Spin, as you can enter or exit your wall climbing state using it to maneuver yourself to some degree. It gives some level of strategy to a moveset that is otherwise best suited to just taking the default path and occasionally wall climbing over your platforming sections, which is never great when the most fun in SRB2 can be found by switching between paths. Sprites-wise, I think BlueM had a good starting concept, but it somewhat falls through in execution. Looking at the sprites, they certainly look like they've been based off the OVA design. From what I've seen of it, those animations essentially had a really lanky classic Sonic, which is basically what we've gotten here. Several animations have been edited to fit the theming, such as braking and ledge teetering, but others look like they've been based more off the Sonic CD opening. The wall running and falling in particular look extremely similar to snippets of that animation. However, the actual sprite work is quite lacking, not necessarily because the sprites have mistakes or anything like that, but just because they look too much like the vanilla sprites. OVA Sonic used to have hand-drawn sprites to emulate that OVA animation aesthetic, but they've been replaced with these new sprites that seem to try and make the OVA design fit into the SRB2 world, but it just means it looks like a stretched out vanilla Sonic with weird eyes. I'm also not a huge fan of the new ball sprites. Again, haven't watched the OVA, so maybe the spin ball design is different there, but this just makes Sonic look like some sort of thorny plant from a lot of angles. So yeah, I'd say the best thing that can happen to the sprite is just to reuse the ones from older versions, as that is clearly what most of these animations were designed for, and they look uncanny in the SRB2 art style. Ignore those people who say that it should have looked more like the vanilla art style. I can understand reasoning for most characters, but considering this character is integrally linked to a particular aesthetic, it removes a lot from them to change it. Also, one last thing, please change the super spin sound effect. It makes my ears bleed every time I use it, with this really high-pitched whistle sound. Ugh, makes me physically recoil. Overall, I think OVA Sonic has potential that it doesn't yet live up to. Obviously, you have a moveset that doesn't seem to quite fully work yet as intended, with the super spin feeling strange to use. But outside of that, BlueM seems to be actively sabotaging their own mod, changing sprites in a way that seems pretty universally disliked, and choosing the most annoying sound possible for OVA Sonic's primary ability. If the sprite were reverted back to their old appearance, the super spin sound effect changed to a less ear-piercing sound, and the ability itself actually fully worked, I'd probably give OVA Sonic a 6, but for now, it'll stay at a 5 out of 10. I hope you enjoy the video, and ciao.